Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's meeting on the Senate Committee on Revenue and Economic Development. Will the Secretary please proceed to call the roll?
Senator Cruz Crawford.
Present.
Senator Steinbeck.
Here.
Senator Stone. Vice Chair Dunyate.
And I am here, and please mark Chair Neal absent excused. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to start off by mentioning that we did have Senate Bill 55 scheduled for today. We did pull that off the agenda. There might be some irregularities with if folks are trying to access on Nellis on what bills are being heard today. We only have one agenda item, and so I want to welcome folks both here in Carson City and in Las Vegas and those watching online. Today we're going to be hearing the second part of the presentation on the consolidated tax distribution by Mr. Nakamoto. Before we get to that, obviously our thoughts are with Senator Neal, the chair of the committee, as she is in her recovery. We are still in the deliberation process of trying to figure out how the committee is going to be operating, but for today we're going to continue on as Senator Neal in her intentions of making sure that we were able to continue and finalize the presentation. And so more announcements as time come, of course, of the operations and some of the bills that will be referred at a later date. And so we just ask folks to give us some grace as we're working through this, and of course to send our thoughts to Senator Neal. So we're going to go ahead and start by, of course, the presentation from Mr. Nakamoto. So Mr. Nakamoto, when you're ready, please proceed.
Thank you, Vice Chair Dunyate. Members of the committee, for the record, my name is Michael Nakamoto. I serve as Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division of the Legislative Council Bureau. And I am honored to be in front of you today to do the second part of the overview of the local government tax distribution account and the consolidated tax distribution. So when we left off, we had just finished the first tier distribution. And so I will bring up the slide with the reminder that these are the 6 revenue sources that make up the first tier of the C-tax. This is the total amount of revenue that is distributed to the local governments or eligible entities through the C-tax distribution, which was just over $2.2 billion in FY24. And again, this makes up a considerable portion of the budgets.
Mr. Nakamoto, can you clarify just to make sure what slide you're starting off from last time, just to make sure?
Yes.
Or the one on the screen?
It is the one on the screen. But for those of you who are who have the binders with you today, hold on one second. This is page 23. And so this is the total. We went through all of the revenues, how they're distributed at the first tier, and then how they make it into those 17 different buckets at the second tier. And then this is the end result. So, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee, this is the diagram that we had put together for the C-tax to explain it. And I had, I believe, mentioned to a couple of you that part, the first tier that I went through yesterday or on Tuesday, was the easy part. I mentioned the C-tax is complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces. Most of the moving pieces are in the second tier. So please feel free to stop me with questions if anything does not make sense. So for the second tier, again, the Department of Taxation receives all of these revenues that either they collect or that they receive from the Department of Motor Vehicles or from county recorders in the case of the RPTT. And they put them into those first tier buckets. So there are 17 different buckets in the first tier. And then there is the distribution to the eligible entities, enterprise districts, local governments, and special districts at the second tier. Again, those are the entities within that county who would be eligible to receive money specifically from those buckets. There is no crossing of the buckets at this point. So entities in Clark County are not receiving money from buckets in Carson City or Washoe County or anywhere else, and vice versa. It is once it gets into that first tier bucket for the county, the entities in that county are the ones who receive that revenue. So the first question is, what are these entities that I'm talking about? And so the first one, the enterprise district, it's any entity that receives C-tax revenue. It's not a city, county, or town, and it has been determined to be an enterprise district by the executive director of the Department of Taxation. And this is the definition in NRS 360.620. And so the question is, okay, what does that really mean? So the executive director needs to make the determination, and they have the 4 criteria that are listed there. And the first is whether that governmental entity should account for substantially all of its operations in an enterprise fund. Second, the number and type of governmental services that that entity provides. Third, whether the governmental entity provides a product or a service directly to a user of that product or service, including without limitation water, sewerage, television, and sanitation. And then D is the catch-all, any other factors that the executive director deems relevant. So you're talking about primarily smaller entities that provide a single service and are operating out of an enterprise fund. The second one is local governments, and this one is a little more straightforward. It's counties, cities, and towns that are eligible to receive a portion of C-tax revenue. And again, this is pursuant to NRS 360.640. And finally, there are special districts, and special districts are any other local government that's eligible for C-tax that does not fit as an enterprise district or a local government. And so that we're talking about general improvement districts and other types of special districts of that sort. And so on the next slide, here is the breakdown of what these entities are. So for FY 2024, there were a total of 11 enterprise districts that received a C-tax distribution. And you can see that there are several in Douglas County. The Kyle Canyon Water District in Clark County is an enterprise district for this purpose. The Elko County Convention and Visitors Authority and the Elko Television District, as well as the Eureka Television District, the Stagecoach and Willow Creek GIDs in Lyon County. And then in Washoe County, there are 2, the Sun Valley Water and Sanitation General Improvement District and the Verdi Television General Improvement District. So these are what have been determined by the Department of Taxation to be enterprise districts, and therefore they are classified as such for the purposes of the second-tier distribution. Local governments, in FY 2024, there were a total of 72 local governments that received a distribution from the C-tax. The 17 counties, and for this purpose I am including Carson City, the 18 cities in the state, and for this purpose, because I don't want to double count them, I'm excluding Carson City, and then 37 towns located throughout the state. So Carson City has no towns. Douglas County has Minden and Gardnerville that are close by. But in Clark County, places like Laughlin, Paradise, Spring Valley, Moapa Valley, and so on are towns that are eligible to receive a C-tax distribution. And then finally, for special districts in FY 2024, there were a total of 65 special districts that received a distribution from the C-tax. And these include water districts, library districts, fire protection districts, GIDs, otherwise known as general improvement districts, hospital districts, and then I put in a catch-all called other special districts. And an example of that is the Churchill County Mosquito Abatement District, which has a sole purpose apparently of reducing the mosquito population out in Churchill County. And those are the types of entities. And again, there are 65 of those that are receiving C-tax revenue. So the distribution of that revenue among those entities, again, depends on what type of entity it is. And so the first thing that the Department of Taxation, before they start distributing revenue, is to determine how much revenue each agent or each of these entities is supposed to receive. And so this gets classified into their base allocation. That is the set amount of revenue that they are supposed to receive each fiscal year by statute, and then what is known as the excess allocation. And then we'll talk about the statutory formulas that are used to determine the excess allocation. So for the base allocation, there are statutory formulas, and I will walk through those for each of the enterprise districts, the local governments, and the special districts. So first, for enterprise districts, their base distribution, the amount of revenue that they are to receive through the second tier of the C-Tax every year, is the same amount as they received in the previous year, which is the same amount that they have received in every fiscal year since the C-Tax began in fiscal year 1999. For an enterprise district, their base distribution for each fiscal year is the same. There is no adjustment to that allocation whatsoever. For local governments and special districts, the fiscal year base distribution is equal to the total amount received by that entity in the prior fiscal year. This includes their base allocation as well as any excess revenue that they received. And then it is adjusted by the percentage change in the consumer price index over the 5 calendar years immediately preceding the fiscal year for which the base distribution is being calculated. So a local government, to determine its base allocation, say for FY25, it is the total amount of revenue that they received from the C-Tax in FY 2024, adjusted by the average percentage change in CPI over calendar years 2020 to 2024. And I did not do the calculation, unfortunately. I'm thinking that number is in the neighborhood of 4 to 5%. So their base allocation, the default amount of revenue that these entities are allowed to receive in FY25 is approximately in that 4% range, higher than the total amount of revenue that they received in FY24. And so this is the very first thing that the Department of Taxation has to figure out as they determine for the local governments and special districts how much revenue was received in the previous fiscal year, adjust that by this 5-year average change in inflation, and that is the base allocation that they are entitled to under the C-Tax distribution at the second tier in the following fiscal year. Now, the C-Tax revenues are largely collected and distributed on a monthly basis. In fact, 5 of the 6 revenue sources are collected and deposited into the local government tax distribution account on a monthly basis. The exception is the real property transfer tax. The RPTT is required statutorily to be remitted to the state on a quarterly basis. There are some counties, such as Washoe County and Eureka County, that collect it, but they remit it to the state on a monthly basis. But the bulk of the counties, including Clark County, remit it to the state on a quarterly basis. However, the SCCRT and BCCRT, along with the liquor tax and cigarette tax, that's collected on a monthly basis and deposited into the account at the end of every month or near the end of every month. The GST is collected and then remitted to the account on a monthly basis as well. So there is revenue that comes to this account on a constant basis, and then the Department of Taxation will distribute it on a monthly basis as well. So then the amount of the distribution to each of these these entities starts with that fiscal year base allocation. So for the enterprise districts, local governments and special districts, the base amount of revenue that they will receive every month from these monthly distributions is exactly 1/12 of that annual amount. So basically, whatever they calculated or whatever that amount is supposed to be, you start off and say, we're dividing it by 12. That is the fixed amount of revenue that they are going to receive as their default or base allocation. So again, for enterprise districts, they receive the same amount of revenue every year that does not increase and has never increased and never will increase under the current law. So that gets divided by 12. So not only are they receiving the same amount of revenue every year, they're receiving the same amount of revenue every month. They're receiving exactly 1/12 of that annual distribution, and that amount stays constant throughout time under the current statute. But the caveat to that is that the monthly base distribution to the enterprise district, this fixed amount that they always receive, is made before any monthly base distributions are made to the local governments and special districts. So they receive a fixed amount, they receive the same amount, but they're guaranteed to receive that amount first before anybody else receives any money. So once you have made the distribution, or the Department of Taxation has made the distribution to those enterprise districts, there's still a pot of money that's left. And so that amount of revenue that is left is available to make the distributions to the local governments and the special districts. And again, the base amount of revenue that they should be receiving every month is exactly 1/12 of that annual calculation that the Department of Taxation makes at the beginning of the year. So the Department of Taxation goes through and they have their calculations. They know how much they're supposed to distribute because they figure that out at the beginning of every fiscal year. And so then they know how much money has gone into the bucket for that county. And so they start then distributing the revenue out. So there are various rules on what happens at this point if there's enough money to make that base distribution to the local governments and special districts or not. So where we start is in the example where the remaining amount of revenue to distribute to the local governments and special districts is not sufficient to make those monthly base allocations. So let's say, for example, we have a situation where the local governments and special districts all should be receiving a total of $1 million. But the bucket at the first tier for that county only had $900,000 in it, so there's not enough to distribute. The remaining amount, that $900,000, is distributed to the local governments and the special districts in proportion of the amount of base revenue that they were supposed to receive in proportion to the total. So let's say it's Clark County, there's $1 million that's supposed to be distributed, and they make up 50% of the first tier distribution. They would, of that $900,000, they would receive half of it, $450,000. They would be shorted by the $50,000. And this happens with all of the local governments and special districts. They are shorted by the same proportional amount in the event that there is not enough money. So let's say then in a month that there is enough money to make the distribution. There's enough, they go through, they do the calculation, they receive the revenue, they've determined there is enough revenue to pay everybody. So they pay everybody their base amount, the 1/12 of their annual base allocation. So then what happens is if there is any revenue remaining after that base allocation, they first have to look back at the previous months of the fiscal year and determine whether there were any months in which they were unable to make that base allocation. So say they only had $900,000 in the first month. They then, in the next month, they have more than enough money. So they make that base allocation as they're required. Any revenue that's remaining after that, they have to go back and use to essentially repay what they shorted in that they had shorted each of these entities in the previous months. And again, they have to do this in a proportional basis. So they're not paying off Clark County before they're paying the city of Las Vegas. They pay that additional revenue in proportion. So if there's not enough money remaining to fully pay that, then the distribution is over, and then they would have to wait for future months in order to pay back what is remaining to cover that shortfall. If there is money that is left over after they've paid off all of the previous months' shortages of the base distribution, this is what is known as excess revenue. And so this is the point, if the second tier probably wasn't already complicated enough, this is where the second tier distribution probably gets really complicated, is how to determine the allocation of what is known as excess revenue. And so in a schematic, this is the easy way to do it. So, but when I actually go to explain this, basically what is happening is you have different statutory formulas that apply to the local governments and the special districts as it pertains to excess revenue. And not only that, there are different statutory formulas depending on which county you are located in. And it's something that is known as 0.02 plus or 1 plus. And I'll explain what that means going forward. So basically the 0.02 plus and 1 plus formulas are formulas that are based on the growth in population or assessed value or both that are used to determine the share of the excess revenue that is distributed among the local governments and special districts. And what this means in getting into the more detail is the .02 plus formula is used only in counties with a population of 100,000 or more. This is Clark and Washoe counties. And so there are two different facets to the .02 plus distribution. So for local governments, that is your cities, counties, and towns. The .02 plus factor says you take 0.02 plus the sum of the 5-year average percentage change in population for that entity as determined by the state demographer, and then the 5-year average percentage change in assessed value. But if the 5-year average percentage change in assessed value is 0 or negative, then that value gets set to 0. So basically it is allocating the shares for the local governments and for that matter the special districts based on their growth. So you're looking at the average change in population and assessed value, taking those and adding them together, then adding .02. And then you do the same thing for the special districts, except that they only use assessed value rather than population. And the reason for this is the population factors, as I mentioned previously, are the state demographer does projections of population according to state law in Chapter 360 of the NRS. And they do it for counties, cities, and towns. The special districts do not have a population because they may overlap multiple entities. They may not have borders that are shared with any entity, or they may be the entire county. So the decision was made to only use assessed value for the special districts. So this calculation is done for each of the entities, the local governments and special districts, and then it's multiplied. These factors that are calculated are multiplied by the base allocation, and then this is used to determine the shares of the excess revenue that is distributed. And so on the next page, because this is probably far easier to explain in a table than it is in words, is a hypothetical example of the excess revenue distribution under this .02 plus formula. So in this hypothetical situation we've set here, there is $1.1 million of C-tax revenue to be distributed in a month, of which $1 million is the base allocation, and there's $100,000 in excess revenue to be set. So we have 5 entities that would be sharing this revenue: the county, 2 cities, and 2 special districts. So for the county, their 5-year average change in population was 1.5%. Their 5-year average change in assessed value was 3%. Those are added together to get 4.5%, and then you add .02 to that, and it turns into .065. And then that is multiplied by their base distribution, which is $300,000 or 30% of the total base, to get their factor of $19,500. And so this is repeated for the city, both cities in fact, so you can see their .02 plus factors are .095 and .08, and they have their distribution factors. And then you have the first special district, which again is only based on assessed value, not on population. And so they take their 2% average growth in assessed value and add the .02 to that, and they get a factor of .04. It's multiplied by their base distribution, which is shown in column G. And then for Special District 2, the last entity on this column, they have an assessed value that's negative. It's minus 1%. So under the rules, they're set to 0 because this amount is not allowed to go negative. So their .02 plus factor is .02. It's .02 plus 0. It's multiplied by their base distribution amount to get the total in column G. And so to determine those shares then, all of those numbers in column G are added together, and then it's each entity's share of that total. So the $19,500 for the county is 26.7% of that total. Therefore, they are entitled to 26.7% of the excess revenue. In this case, what you'll note is this formula tends to reward growth. The city, in City 1 that had a 5-year average population growth of 2.5% and an average 5-year assessed value of 5%, has the highest 0.02 plus factor at 0.095 because they had the highest population. And as a result, once that's multiplied by their base distribution amount, they end up with the highest share of the excess revenue. They get 39% under this, with the special district having no growth, getting approximately 1.4% of the revenue. And so I'm hoping that this is an easier way to explain the 0.02 plus. And again, this is how the excess revenue is determined in Clark and Washoe counties. Is this a good time, Mr. Vice Chair, to stop for questions, or should I move on to the 1 plus?
Thank you. Committee members, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair. How often do we get excess funding? Sorry, what table is that on? I'm trying to see what.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, Senator Cruz Crawford, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I would have to go back. I didn't have the monthly distributions
Okay.
of the C-tax in any of the information that I have. I believe more often than not, there is excess revenue. So the Department of Taxation is doing these calculations on, I don't want to say a monthly basis, but more often than not, there is a distribution of excess revenue.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So,
Senator Cruz Crawford, did I answer your question? You have a follow-up?
I have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
okay, so my other question is, I'm looking at the table 1 consolidated tax first tier distribution by county. And then I was just clarifying then, so that change rate, if it's in a positive, that's an excess? Okay, and then,
Let me clarify for you, Senator Cruz Crawford. Michael Nakamoto for the record. This is the first tier distribution that's on Table 1. The percentage change is the growth in that first tier revenue from year to year. It does not necessarily reflect excess revenue because the excess calculation is based on, it's the revenue in the previous year adjusted by the 5-year average change in inflation. So if the growth rate for the total actually might be less than inflation, there could possibly be no excess revenue. But again, this is because the C-tax is distributed on a monthly basis, it will vary from month to month as to whether there is excess revenue or not, just because there's fluctuations in how the revenue is collected.
thank you so much, Vice Chair. Through you, I just had a question. Would you be able to provide us that table of excess so that we can kind of see, is that available for us?
Thank you, Senator Cruz Crawford, Michael Nakamoto for the record. The Department of Taxation does publish the distributions at the first and second tier every month. They don't necessarily break out what is base revenue and what is excess revenue, but they make those tables public on their website. It would take some effort for us to go and kind of reverse engineer it to show how much is base and how much is excess, but that is something that we could look at putting together for you.
What I'm kind of thinking is, as we see that other pockets kind of drop, like what's that excess make up for it? Does that make sense? Is that a way to compute?
Senator Cruz Crawford, Michael Nakamoto for the record. If the revenues are falling, then it's perhaps not likely that there's going to be any excess revenue. So say, for example, right now, the C-tax for by and large at the first tier is flat or negative. Year-to-date through the first 4 months of FY25. And that's, again, primarily because the C-tax is primarily driven by sales tax, and right now, sales tax is down for all of the rates. The assumptions for the growth in the C-tax, that base calculation, is assuming growth. So because every entity is supposed, their base allocation is supposed to be the amount of revenue that they received in the previous year, then increased by that 5-year average of inflation. And as long as that 5-year average of inflation is positive, then the base allocation is going to be higher than the amount of revenue that they received in the previous year. Right now, though, with sales tax down, I believe by and large C-tax collections for the entire first tier are down, and that is information that is included in the tables, and I can get to that when we do in some of the tables further back dealing with the second tier. If there is not, in that instance, it is very unlikely if the revenue is down that they're not even going to be able to meet the base allocation, therefore there would be no excess to distribute.
So the answer is no, pretty much. We don't have a lot of excess. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. 42 more slides to go. Let's go.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Again, for the record, Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. So in all of the counties whose population is less than 100,000, there is a different distribution factor, and that is the 1+. And so the easy way to explain it is it works exactly the same as the 0.02+, but instead of using 0.02+, you are using 1+ the sum of the 5-year average percentage change in population and the 5-year average percentage change in assessed value for the local governments, whereas the special districts are 1+ the 5-year average percentage change in assessed value. Otherwise, the mechanics are exactly the same, and everything works the same as the 0.02+. So here is the same hypothetical situation with the same county, the same cities, the same special districts, and all those growth rates are the same. But what you can see is instead of it being 0.02+ in that the yellow column, column D, it is 1+ that, and then those are multiplied by the base distribution amounts to get that column G total, which then determines the shares of the excess revenue. And I had mentioned that the 0.02+ tended to reward growth in that fastest growing city got the most base or the most excess revenue. The 1+ doesn't necessarily do that, because you can see even though the growth, but that sum of the growth in column C between the county and the city is considerably larger. The county at 4.5% and the city at 7.5%, they have the same base distribution amount. In the previous example, they had wildly different results, whereas here you can see that the difference is only $9,000 when you make that calculation. And then the difference in the excess distribution goes from $29,786, or 29.8% of the excess, to $30,642, or 30.6% of the excess. So the 1+ is a little less responsive to growth than the 0.02+, but that is also part of kind of how the difference and the mechanics of the C-tax work. And so then this is going to beg the question of why. Why is it set up like this? Why did all of this get put into place in the first place? Why am I doing this presentation and explaining this complicated formula to all of you today? And so this is where I have the concluding part of this portion of the presentation is talking about a brief history of the C-tax. And so this brief history of the C-tax actually goes back quite a ways. In fact, it goes back into the 1930s. So The issue with the C-tax has really never been about the first-tier distribution of revenue. And we talked about that on Tuesday, where I talked about how the cigarette tax, the liquor tax, and the out-of-state portion of the BCCRT are distributed per capita. That is, it goes in proportion to each county's share of the statewide population. The SCCRT has its first-tier distribution with the guaranteed and the non-guaranteed counties. The RPTT and the GST go back to the county in which the taxable activity occurred. That has never really been the issue with the distribution of C-tax revenues. What it really has been the issue has been that second-tier distribution. That is, when it gets to the county, how is it distributed? And so what this part of the exercise is going to do is kind of back up to what the world looked like before the creation of the C-tax. And I'm talking specifically in the mid-90s, right before the C-tax was actually created. So the BCCRT, as I mentioned previously, the in-state proceeds were returned to the county in which the revenue was generated. The out-of-state proceeds from the BCCRT were distributed among counties by population. But when the BCCRT was first put into place by Assembly Bill 369 of the 1981 session, that second-tier distribution looked a lot different. So if it is a county that has no incorporated cities, we'll use Carson City as an example. They are the entity that is the entity, the only entity here. There is no other city. The County General Fund got all of the proceeds from the BCCRT. If the county has one incorporated city, we'll use Lincoln County as an example. It's Lincoln County and the city of Caliente. The proceeds from the BCCRT that are collected in, or were collected in Lincoln County or any other county that only had one city, between the county government and the city government based on their respective shares of the county's population. So if the county has 75% of the population and the city has 25% of the population, then the county got 75% of the revenue and the city got 25% of the revenue. But let's look at counties that had two or more incorporated cities, and there are several of those. Elko County, Washoe County, and more particularly for all of you, Clark County. If a county had two or more incorporated cities, under AB 369 of the 1981 session, the BCCRT was apportioned among the cities by population, and the County General Fund received no revenue whatsoever. So this was the distribution that was settled upon by the legislature in AB 369 of the 1981 session as it pertained to the BCCRT. So the SCCRT, as I went through the whole discussion of the guaranteed and non-guaranteed counties, those were set up in Assembly Bill 104 of the 1991 session and Senate Bill 506 of the 1993 session as the offshoot of something called fair share. So there were distributional questions of the SCCRT from its original inception, again in Assembly Bill 369 of the 1981 session. And so what came out of that is what I talked about, that the rural counties were set up as guaranteed counties. They received a fixed amount of revenue every month, regardless of where it was generated, whether it was equal to what they generated or not. And then the remaining counties, including Clark and Washoe, received their proportionate share of the revenues after the rural counties received their fixed shares. The SCCRT, as I mentioned previously, was set up as a replacement for property tax under something called the tax shift that happened during the late 70s and early 80s, where the statewide property tax rates were lowered and offset by increases in sales tax to recover revenue primarily for local governments. So the county share of SCCRT would be determined, and then within the county at the second tier, each entity that was eligible to receive SCCRT revenue received their share of revenue based on their assessed value or the total revenue, or their property tax revenue as a share of the total property tax revenue collected in the county. So this is going to come to be a theme, that you have these varying distributions for all of these revenues. So for the motor vehicle privilege tax, which is now known as the governmental services tax, this was originally put into place in the 1963 session following a constitutional amendment that was approved by the legislature in legislative sessions in 1960 and 1961. And that's the useless trivia for all of you today. There was an even-numbered year session in 1960. It was an experiment that did not last very long from my recollection. But then the voters approved it as question 1 at the November 1962 ballot. And basically this constitutional amendment and this question said that motor vehicles are exempt from property tax, but if this was approved, then the legislature would have to impose a privilege tax to offset the revenue. And so as a result, in 1963, the legislature came in, created the motor vehicle privilege tax, which is now the GST, and distributed it primarily to replace property tax revenue. So motor vehicle privilege tax revenue, or GST revenue, was returned to the county in which the vehicle was registered at the first tier. And then school districts and local governments who were eligible for property tax in FY 1981 were eligible to receive a distribution of the motor vehicle privilege tax revenue, with the exception of anyone who would have received less than $100. They got no revenue, and it was apportioned out among everybody else. And that came into place in Assembly Bill 422 of the 1977 session. So then RPTT, this was put into place in the 1967 session and was primarily a state revenue source. But over the span of a decade, it became a local government revenue source, and in Assembly Bill 268 of the 1979 session, became exclusively a local government revenue source. As I mentioned previously, the RPTT revenue is returned to the county in which the transfer of the real property occurs and where the title was recorded. And so then once the county's share was determined, then there was a distribution of those proceeds among the county and cities. So if the county has no incorporated cities, the county general fund received all of the revenue. And this is similar to what I discussed with the BCCRT. If the county had one incorporated city, the county by default would receive 1/4 of the proceeds. The remaining 3/4 of the proceeds would be distributed between the county and the city based on their population. So somewhat similar to the BCCRT, but again, different. And then if the county had 2 or more incorporated cities, the county did receive proceeds. They received the 25%, but then that remaining 75% was distributed among the cities based on their respective populations. So again, another distribution that was completely different than any of the other distributions, and this was really the issue that was being addressed. And then finally, the cigarette tax and the liquor tax, I'll talk about separately, even though they're different taxes and were put into place at different times. So as I mentioned previously, at the first tier, cigarette tax was distributed based in per capita shares. So if Clark County had 75% of the population, Clark County got 75% of the cigarette tax revenue. Same with the liquor tax. And so those were the first tier distributions back when these laws were put into place in 1967 and 1969. And then they had the second tier distribution. And the second tier distribution for these was identical, and it's the same as the BCCRT. So if it's a county with no cities, the county receives all of the money. If it is a county with one city, the county and the city share that money based on population. And then if the county had 2 or more incorporated cities, then the proceeds were distributed among the cities based on their populations, and the county received no money. So needless to say, this was confusing. And from my understanding of the situation, as I've talked to people who were involved in this, many of whom have long since either retired or passed away, it was also fairly contentious. And so by the time you got to 1995, there was a discussion among legislators of, we really need to address this distribution of local government revenues. And it wasn't so much that first-tier distribution, they were worried about that second-tier distribution. So the legislature in the 1995 session passed Senate Concurrent Resolution number 40, which required the Legislative Commission to create a subcommittee tasked to conduct an interim study relating to the distribution of certain tax revenues among local governments within counties. And so they were looking at things like the local school support tax, which is dedicated to K-12 education, aviation and motor vehicle fuels, including gasoline, which also have an equally complicated distribution formula, liquor tax, tobacco tax, the motor vehicle privilege tax, gaming license taxes, and the real property transfer tax. So SCR 40 was made up of 8 legislators, 2 members of Senate Government Affairs, 2 members of the Senate Committee on Taxation, 2 members of the Assembly Committee on Government Affairs, and 2 members of the Assembly Committee on Taxation from the 1995 session. The committee was chaired by former Senator Ann O'Connell. And it also had a subcommittee or an advisory committee that was formed to assist this subcommittee. And it involved the executive director of the Department of Taxation, 2 members of what was known as the Local Government Advisory Committee, 3 members of government involved in county government, and then 3 members involved in city government. And so many of the people who were on that are people who are still involved in some sort of capacity in government, such as Guy Hobbs, who is the current chair of the Commission on School Funding, who at the time was working for Clark County, Marvin Levitt, who is a member of the Economic Forum, the chair of the Committee on Local Government Finance, who at the time was working for the city of Las Vegas, Mary Walker, who for the longest time was a lobbyist on behalf of some of the more rural governments up here, but at the time was working for the Carson City and other people. And so there were 8 people involved to assist the subcommittee, and then the subcommittee was required to submit a report of its findings to the legislature for the 1997 session. And so on this slide here are the 7 recommendations for the SCR 40 subcommittee report. That they should consider legislation providing for a new formula for the distribution among the local governments within the county of the BCCRT, the SCCRT, the liquor tax, the tobacco tax, the real property transfer tax, and the motor vehicle privilege tax, which again sounds familiar. And then they went through a bunch of other things in setting the base allocations, fixing the shares or the revenue received by enterprise districts at a set amount permanently, allowing for cooperative or interlocal agreements for alternative distributions of the formula, and so on. And so the legislature ultimately would adopt many of these recommendations in Senate Bill 254 of the 1997 session, which created the C-Tax. So basically the C-Tax was created in this bill, and it first required the creation of the Local Government Tax Distribution Fund, which is now known as the Local Government Tax Distribution Account, to receive the revenues from those 6 revenue sources, and then leaving the first-tier distributions from the account identical or largely identical to the first-tier distributions of revenue for each of the revenues as they existed prior to 1997. Again, the first-tier distribution really was not the contentious part as I understand it. It was more about the second-tier distribution. And so after that was created, there were a series of formulas that were determined or that were created to determine the allocation of revenue to the eligible entities at the second tier. And so an eligible entity for the purpose of the C-Tax as it was created is that you had to have been receiving at least one of the 6 revenues before the creation of the C-Tax. So for a lot of these smaller entities, your enterprise districts and your special districts, primarily they were receiving SCCRT or GST revenue. But then for the larger entities, your counties and cities, they were receiving the liquor tax, the cigarette tax, the RPTT, as well as some of the others. So the base amount of for the eligible entities beginning in FY 1999 was set as noted in those two bullet points there. The enterprise districts, that fixed amount that I discussed previously that they receive on a permanent basis, is the average amount of revenue that those enterprise districts received from FY 1996 and FY 1997, with no further adjustment to that amount going forward. Local governments and special districts also receive the average amount of revenue that they received in FY 1996 and 1997, adjusted for the percentage change between the total amounts received by all local governments and special districts in that county for FY 1997, and the average of the total amounts received by those entities during FY 1996 and 1997, and then further adjusted by the change in the CPI for the last 6 months of calendar year 1997. And so that is how the base allocation was set for the first year. And then for subsequent years, there was the distribution of, or the calculation of the base after that. So enterprise districts received the same amount of revenue as I previously noted. So local governments and special districts received the total amount allocated in the previous year. So their base revenue plus any excess multiplied by 1 plus the percentage change in the CPI for the immediately preceding calendar year. So rather than the 5-year average, they received all of the revenue that they received in the previous year adjusted by the previous year's inflation. So very similar to what they receive now, but with the one difference being that CPI adjustment being for 1 year rather than 5 years. And then it made sure that the enterprise districts received 1/12 of their annual allocation every month before any distribution could be made. And so then after the allocations were made to the eligible enterprise districts, it set up the distribution of the revenue to the local governments and special districts. And in its initial setup, the whole idea of everybody got their base revenue first, and then if they didn't get their base revenue, you proportioned that out, and then you went to the next month, gave everybody their base allocation, and then determined if there were in any previous months you weren't able to make the base allocation, and then anything beyond that was in excess. That all was original to SB 254 of the 1997 session. So basically the difference, though, is the calculation of the excess revenue. And so I went through and I talked about the 1 plus and the 0.02 plus for the distribution of the excess revenue. As it was set up in SB 254 of the 1997 session, all of the entities were under the 1 plus formula. So think back to the discussion and the part of the presentation where that was all laid out. That's how everybody received that revenue. So, and that applied to both local governments and special districts, again, based on their assessed value or change in population, or in the case of local governments, both. Special districts not having the population, so that was not used. And so that is how it was distributed beginning in FY 1999. And then what it did also allow is for local governments to enter into interlocal agreements. If 2 or more governments decided we're not satisfied with the formula, we want the revenue to be distributed a certain way, they could agree to that. The governing bodies of each of those entities would have to agree to it by a majority vote, and then a written the interlocal agreement had to be filed with the Department of Taxation no later than December 31st, preceding the fiscal year in which that alternative distribution was to take effect. So almost immediately there were changes to the C-tax. This is the formula that was approved, but because there were still perhaps disagreements on the second tier distribution, the legislature would come in with subsequent legislation. And so one of the recommendations from that SCR 40 subcommittee was to create an interim legislative committee and advisory committee to continue the study of revenue. So they met again during the next interim, went through the issues again, and came up with a couple of other recommendations, one of which is mentioned on this page, SB 534 of the 1999 session, which basically took into account the fact that because your base allocations and your excess were based on population, assessed value, and other factors that could possibly go negative, it allowed the Department of Taxation to review the allocations to local governments or special districts where their population and assessed value are actually decreasing over a period of at least 3 consecutive years. And so they, rather than going with the formula, this change in the law allowed the Department of Taxation to recommend adjustments to the distribution that are contrary to what the formula said. And then the Committee on Local Government and Finance and the Nevada Tax Commission could approve or deny those changes. And if they were approved, then there would be adjustments to the formula to take that into account. And so it was basically the realization that some of these local governments may not be gaining population or assessed value, and that this was in essence a way to hold them, if not completely harmless, but mitigate some of those reductions that could occur under the formula. So then in the 2001 session, and specifically is the 17th special session, which happened shortly after the 2001 session, there was another significant change to the distribution formula at the second tier in Assembly Bill 10 of the 17th special session. And so the first thing that it did is say that to determine the base allocation for a fiscal year, it wasn't the total amount of revenue from the previous year adjusted by inflation. It was only the base distribution in the previous year multiplied by 1 plus the percentage change in population. Which ultimately what this does is it creates less base and more excess. So there was more excess revenue to be distributed. And so then this bill additionally phased out the 1 plus formula, which is 1 plus your change in assessed value and population for local governments, 1 plus the change in assessed value for special districts in determining the excess, in favor of a formula that said you take those 2 factors and you don't add anything to them. It's known as the no 1 plus formula. So this was something that, based on my discussions with individuals who were involved, reading of minutes, and when I noted that there was kind of more rewarding of growth in the 0.02 plus formula as opposed to the 1 plus formula, this was designed in a way to reward growth. So you take away that 1 plus, you start driving differences in the growth between those entities, and combined with the change to put more excess revenue by taking some out of the base, it was in essence getting more money into excess revenue and getting more revenue to the entities that were growing compared to the entities where the growth was not so great. So it did not take very long for consequences from that to occur in entities or in counties where there was not a lot of growth. In fact, under the no 1 plus formula, if you happen to have a county where there was no growth in assessed value and population, the no 1 plus factor caused everything to go negative in terms of those calculations, and it was in fact impossible to determine the calculations. So in Senate Bill 469 of the 2003 session, it allowed for the usage of the 1 plus formula for the second tier distribution instead of the no 1 plus in any county where the sum of population and assessed valuation growth for each local government is negative. Because if they're all negative, then it would be impossible under the no 1 plus to actually distribute excess revenue. So they needed a way to do it, so they allowed them to use the 1 plus formula. And so the next session, Senate Bill 38 of the 2005 session, also allowed the usage of the 1+ formula in a county where the average net proceeds of minerals was 50 million or more, or whose average population growth in the last 5 fiscal years was negative, or if both of those conditions occurred. And so this was taking into account now entities where there might have been some of those local governments or special districts that had growth, but not all of them did. And so in that instance, anybody who had growth, even if it was you had one entity that had very small growth and everybody else was negative, the end result of the no 1+ formula said that that one entity that had very small growth got all of the excess revenue. And so that is the type of situation that Senate Bill 38 of the 2005 session was trying to address. And so by this point, you had a lot of the local governments in rural counties that were on the 1+, but then in the more urban counties, you had the no 1+. And so then we fast forward to Senate Bill 31 of the 2011 session, which was brought to the legislature at the beginning of session, but around the beginning part of May, there was a request among the entities in Clark County for a one-time extension of the deadline for local governments to enter into an interlocal agreement. As I noted previously, this was originally set in SB 254 of the 1997 session at December 31st of the previous year. But as these local governments were getting into the spring, they were, and especially in Clark County, they were realizing that the no 1+ formula was going to result in one local government, specifically the city of Mesquite, receiving the majority of the excess revenue, and we're talking about tens, or if not hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, and all of the larger local governments would receive none. So a bill was passed, Senate Bill 31, which had some other technical changes, was amended to allow local governments for FY 2012 only to enter into an interlocal agreement as late as May 31st, and to basically allow Clark County to revise the distribution to make everybody happy, because Mesquite was not interested in keeping everybody's money, and the other entities were not interested in Mesquite keeping all of the money either. So the other thing that was happening at the time is that Assembly Bill 71 was being considered and approved, and it required the Legislative Commission to create a subcommittee to study the local government tax distribution account and the C-tax, and that is the last time that that has occurred. And that was an interim study that was staffed by Fiscal Analysis Division staff. It is where a lot of this information, like this slide deck, was originally put together. I just updated it. And it was 6 members of the taxation committee. So the chair was former Assembly Taxation Chair and current Clark County Commissioner Marilyn Kirkpatrick, as well as Assembly members, now Senators Skip Daly and John Ellison, and then Senator David Parks, Senator John Lee, the former mayor of North Las Vegas, and Senator Mike McGinnis. And so they had a number of meetings and a host of recommendations that they returned back in Assembly Bill 68 of the 2013 session, which repealed the no 1+ formula entirely based on the issues that had been previously mentioned, with perhaps the final straw being that interlocal agreement that was required for Clark County in FY 2012, and then allowed the larger counties to use the 0.02+ that I discussed previously, and then allowed assessed value to be set at 0 if it went negative. And then to address the interlocal agreement issue that was previously mentioned, the interlocal agreement date was moved from December 31st to April 30th to allow additional time for the local governments to see what the budget and the revenues were going to be, and then make the decisions if they wanted to or not. So there, for the rest of the slide presentation, Mr. Vice Chair, I was not intending on going through a lot of the other slides today. This was a lot of information that is in here more as a reference, but I'll kind of go through them very quickly just to show the information that is here. And so the first is more information about that initial calculation of the base amount back in in Senate Bill 254 of the 1997 session that were used to prime the C-tax for the first distribution in FY 1999. So that is on slides 51 and 52. Slide 53 is the provisions relating to the adjustments of local government or special district base allocations after their population and assessed value has decreased over 3 consecutive years. And those were the provisions that were put in place in SB 534 of the 1999 session. And then in on slide 54 are the provisions limiting the usage of C-tax revenue for the payment of bonds, which were put into place in the original law as well. And then the provisions relating to interlocal agreements and how those are set up are on slides 55 and 56, as well as slide 57. And then on slide 58 is just a summary of the legislation that governed the interlocal agreement process. So the original provisions from SB 254 of the 1997 session, then the one-time distribution or alternative to that in SB 31 of the 2011 session to allow Clark County to make that interlocal agreement for FY 2012, and then the changes that came out of that interim study during the 2012 interim that were put into place in AB 68 of the 2013 session. On slide 59 are the provisions relating to the ability for new governments to receive C-tax revenue. The first is outdated legislation dealing with governmental entities created between July 1st, 1996 and July 1st, 1998, and their ability to receive C-tax revenue. And then underneath that is NRS 360.740, which deals with the provisions going forward of any newly created local government or special district and their ability to receive C-tax revenue. And basically, they have to take on certain services. So a new entity is required to provide police protection and at least 2 of 3 other services, which are fire protection, construction, maintenance, and repair of roads, or parks and recreation. And if they are able to do that, then they may petition to the tax commission for an increase or an allocation of C-tax revenue, or say it's an existing entity that is currently receiving revenue, such as a town that wants to incorporate and become a city. If they're willing to take on these services, they can petition for additional C-tax revenue, which is largely based on the value of the services that they are taking on. Those provisions and all of the process continue on slide 60. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going through that, but that is all here for your information. On page 61 is the distribution of C-tax revenue at the second tier to library districts. Library districts in Clark and Nye County do receive revenue from the C-tax at the second tier. You can see Boulder City, Henderson, and the Las Vegas Clark County Library District receive money at the second tier in Clark County. And then in Nye County, the Amargosa Library District, the Beatty Library District, and then Pahrump, Smoky Valley, and Tonopah also do. And so again, C-tax is distributed to entities that were receiving one of the 6 revenues back when this was created. And so one of the questions that always arose was the North Las Vegas Library District. So the slide that was put in here back in 2012, which I left in here, relates to Assembly Bill 441 of the 1993 session, which created the North Las Vegas Library District, in which their city charter was amended to create this district, but you can see the bolded subsection 3 under section 2.310 the district is not entitled to receive any distribution of the supplemental city-county relief tax. And because they were created without an allocation of the SCCRT, they were not eligible to receive C-tax under the provisions that were created. So before I conclude, and I have my questions slide up here, I might as well go through the tables that were provided to you so you know what the information is in here. So Senator Cruz Crawford had already mentioned Table 1, which is on page 63 of the packet, and this is the first tier distributions by county. So how much BCCRT, or how much revenue was actually distributed at the first tier to each of the counties, so by fiscal year. So starting in FY 2018, working your way all the way up to FY 2024. So you can see that there was the total of just under 1.5 billion in FY 2018, and we are at just over 2.2 billion in FY 2024, but you can see how those revenues were allocated amongst the 17 buckets at the first tier. So beginning on page 65 is Table 2, and there are actually a number of Table 2s. It goes from Table 2A to 2G, and this is the distribution of each of the revenue sources at the first tier. So how much BCCRT went to each of the counties in FY 2024 on Table 2A, and then SCCRT, cigarettes, liquor, RPT, and GST. And so you can see there are two colored columns there. So the orange salmon colored column is that county's share of the total of each of those revenue sources. So for example, Carson City in FY 2024 received just under $8.8 million of BCCRT. That made up 2.1% of the total BCCRT. Then the green column is how much of that revenue was, that revenue as the share of the total revenue received by the entity at the first tier. So that 8.7 or almost $8.8 million of the SCC or the BCCRT revenue for Carson City in FY24, it was 2.1% of the total BCCRT, but it made up 19.6% of the first tier distribution to Carson City. And so that is available for all of the revenues here. Going back to FY 2018, which is on Table 2G. Because we're looking at multiple years, it was easier just to make separate tables for each of the fiscal years. So Table 3, and again, this is the tables for multiple tables going through multiple counties. Table 3 is the second tier C-tax distributions by entity and fiscal year. So, and for these tables going from tables 3A to 3L, they're broken down by county. So for example, on page 73, you can see that these are the second tier distributions for the local governments and special districts in Carson City and Churchill County. So the only local government, for example, in Carson City is the Consolidated Municipality of Carson City. They have two special districts, of which one is only receiving revenue right now. So this is how it is allocated using those statutory formulas at the second tier, and those totals will match what the first tier distribution was on the previous tables. And so we've set up separate tables because it's a lot of information and a lot of entities for counties. So some of them we were able to fit two counties on one page, but if you turn to Table 3B on page 74, this is Clark County's table. They have a lot of local governments and special districts, and in fact, as I previously noted, they have one enterprise district, the Kyle Canyon Water District, and this is, so they all only fit, you can only get one county on this page. But again, you can see the second tier distributions here. Kyle Canyon Water District as an enterprise district is receiving $10,346 per year. That's all they are ever going to receive. And then all of the local governments, we have the county listed first. then all of the cities, Boulder City, Henderson, Las Vegas, Mesquite, and North Las Vegas, and then the towns, Bunkerville through Winchester, and their distributions at the second tier below that, and then all of the special districts below, the library districts and your fire protection districts, to come up with the total of the second tier distributions for Clark County, and again through FY 2018 through FY 2024. For tables, for the table 3 set, the last ones that I want to point out begin on page 82. And these are the second tier C-tax distributions for Washoe County and White Pine County. And it's nice that alphabetically they fall next to each other, because why I want to point these out is you can see on page 82, you have a number of the entities that are highlighted in that orange or salmon color. And basically what that is indicating is these are entities where there is an interlocal agreement in place, or there has been an interlocal agreement in place for one or more of these fiscal years. So table 3J on page 82 shows the distributions before the interlocal agreement. That is, here is what the statute provides. Once they go through and do all the calculations, doing either the 0.02 plus or the 1 plus, this is what these entities are supposed to receive. And then when you go to page 3K, on page 83, this is after the interlocal agreements, and this is based on the interlocal agreements, what each entity actually did receive. And so that you don't have to go back and forth to see what the differences are, on page 84 is table 3L, which shows the difference between the two. That is, what is the net distributional change as a result of the interlocal agreement. So you can see in table 3L, so for FY 2024, the Washoe County interlocal agreement is exclusively between the Palomino Valley General Improvement District and the Truckee Meadows Fire Protection District, in which $75,258 of the revenue that should have gone to the Truckee Meadows Fire Protection District was instead given to the Palomino Valley GID as a result of the interlocal agreement. And then in White Pine County, you can see that they have a similar interlocal agreement, but in this instance, it affects every local government and special district in those counties. And so what I would note for this table is the interlocal agreement for White Pine County actually ended at the end of FY 2024. They are no longer under an interlocal agreement, and I believe that will probably have something to do with the fact that they are now a non-guaranteed county under the SCCRT, and as a result are receiving significantly more revenue than they were in previous fiscal years. So then turning to page 4, is information that was put together on the first tier distributions by county for each entity. So similar to table 1, except it is for the first 4 months of each fiscal year, so the July through October period between FY 2018 and FY 2025. So you can see for most of the entities, not all of them, but for most, the first 4 months of first-tier distributions of the C-tax were negative. Your exceptions are Esmeralda County, which is a guaranteed county under the SCCRT, as well as Humboldt County, which I would have to look into see why that is the case, but Mineral County and is a non-guaranteed county, or is a guaranteed county. Story County is a non-guaranteed county, but there is a lot of activity going on out there, and it may have driven their sales tax. But White Pine County had a significant increase, and I believe this would be attributable to them going from non-guaranteed, or from guaranteed to non-guaranteed beginning in FY 2025. So table 5 on page 87 is the first tier collections by revenue source for that same period from FY 2018 to FY 2025, again for the first 4 months of each fiscal year. And again, you can see the total C-tax at the first tier through the first 4 months of FY 2025 is negative by 1.2%. And so perhaps this will illustrate Senator Cruz Crawford's earlier question about current excess revenue. In individual months, there could have been, because it again is a month-to-month thing, but right now, because the total is negative, it's unlikely that there has been much or any, or if any, excess revenue through the first 4 months of FY 2025. And then finally, on Table 6, which begins on page 89, this is the information for the second-tier distributions for each of the entities in all 17 counties for the first 4 months of each fiscal year, beginning in FY 2020 and going through FY 2025. I didn't want to make the font so small by putting in the other 2 fiscal years that you couldn't read it. So I cut off FY 18 and 19 to provide more information. And again, this goes all the way through to Table 6J on page 98, which is the second-tier C-tax distributions for Washoe County and White Pine County, with the note on there that Washoe County still has that interlocal agreement, but White Pine County does not have an interlocal agreement as of FY 2025. And then finally, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee, on page 99 is a 9-page summary of key legislation that was passed relating to the C-tax distribution. Most of the changes involved in this were more dealing again with the second-tier distribution. There were some other procedural things that were addressed. There has been very little change to the first-tier distribution of any of the revenues. In fact, to my recollection, there has only been one change, which was in that bill that came out of the interim study in 2011, which was Assembly Bill 68 of the 2013 session. It made some technical changes to the usage of the population for cigarette tax, liquor tax, and the out-of-state portion of the BCCRT, just changing the timing on that. And that's really the only first-tier change. I didn't go through a lot of these bills in my presentation. They weren't included, so there's additional information here beyond the slides. But again, it is here for your reference. This whole thing was put together for your reference because, again, this is not an easy topic. There are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that I didn't go through, but this was intended to be a high-level overview without getting too far in the weeds. But again, this is something where it's kind of hard to explain the C-tax without at least getting a little bit into the weeds. So with that, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee, that concludes my presentation, and I would be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nakamoto. Any questions from the committee members? Nope. Very thorough. We respect the efforts that you put on this, and I'm sure if we have any follow-up questions, we'll be sure to do so. I know Senator Cruz Crawford has a few of them, so maybe we can dig more into that. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. You all know where to find me.
Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and close this agenda item and move on to the last agenda item, which is public comment. If there's any public comment here in Carson City or in Las Vegas, we ask for folks to come forward. Once again, it's reserved for 2 minutes per person. Seeing none in Carson City or in Las Vegas, AVH, is there anyone virtually?
Thank you, Chair. The line is currently open. However, you have no callers at this time.
Thank you so much. Committee members, do we have any questions or any closing remarks? Seeing none, as I mentioned earlier, we're still trying to figure out the logistics for next week in terms of the agenda items and how we're going to proceed forward. And so more will come soon, but for now, we're just going to go ahead and adjourn, and then we'll stay in touch with all folks. So thank you so much for joining us, and the meeting's now adjourned.